The grandfather clock in the presidential palace struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through marble corridors that had witnessed decades of power and politics. Outside, Ouagadougou slept under a blanket of clouds heavy with approaching rain. The city's heartbeat had slowed to the rhythm of night watchmen's footsteps and the distant hum of generators keeping essential services alive. President Ibrahim Traore sat in his private study, surrounded by mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound volumes of history, economics, and political theory. The books seemed to mock him tonight. What use was theoretical knowledge when the reality of his nation remained hidden behind carefully crafted reports and sanitized statistics? Before him lay three separate folders, each marked with different levels of security clearance. The first contained economic projections showing modest growth in gold exports, numbers that should have brought satisfaction. The second held diplomatic correspondence from international partners praising Burkina Faso's stability. The third, marked confidential, contained intelligence reports about regional security concerns. None of them told him about the children. The tea on his desk had grown cold hours ago, steam no longer rising from the delicate porcelain cup his wife had given him for their 20th anniversary. She had been gone for 3 years now, taken by an illness that all his presidential power couldn't cure. In her absence, the palace felt less like a home and more like an elaborate prison. Through the tall windows he could see the city lights twinkling like fallen stars. Somewhere among those lights lived 8 million people who called him their leader. How many of them went to bed hungry? How many children fell asleep on floors instead of beds? How many mothers worried that their sons and daughters might disappear into the shadows of industries that preferred to operate in darkness? The president's chief of staff, Minister Bakari, had left at 10 o'clock after briefing him on tomorrow's agenda: a meeting with French mining executives, a photo session with visiting diplomats, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new government building. All important, all necessary, all utterly disconnected from the pulse of real life in his country. Status quo, he whispered to himself, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. The comfortable lie of progress. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the rain-heavy clouds for a brief moment before thunder rolled across the sky. The president felt his eyelids growing heavy, weighted down by exhaustion and a growing sense that something fundamental was missing from his understanding of his own nation. As sleep began to claim him, his last conscious thought was a prayer he hadn't uttered since childhood. "Show me what I cannot see." The dream began in darkness. He found himself standing on cracked earth under a moonless sky. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of civilization. But as he stood there, he began to hear something that made his blood freeze. The sound of small hands clawing at dirt, of children's voices whimpering in exhaustion and pain. He moved forward, though the ground beneath him felt like it was shifting, pulling him downward. With each step, the sounds grew clearer, more desperate, the scratching of fingernails against stone, the shallow breathing of malnourished lungs, the occasional sob quickly stifled by fear. Suddenly, the earth gave way beneath him, and he found himself falling into a pit. When he landed, mud splashed up around his ankles, cold and thick with the smell of human sweat and desperation. The walls around him were rough-hewn dirt and stone, supported by rotting wooden beams that groaned under the weight of the earth above. This was no ordinary place. This was hell disguised as economics. Children emerged from the shadows like ghosts. Boys no older than 10, their rib cages visible through torn shirts, dragged buckets of dirt that weighed nearly as much as they did. Girls with hollow eyes and scarred hands sifted through piles of mud and rock, searching for flecks of gold that would buy them another day of life. One child, A boy who couldn't have been more than 7 stumbled and fell under the weight of his burden. A man in military fatigues kicked him in the ribs and shouted something in French about quotas and worthless mouths to feed. The president tried to move, tried to intervene, but found his feet rooted to the spot. He was a spectator, powerless to act, forced to witness horrors that his conscious mind had refused to acknowledge. Then she appeared, a little girl, perhaps 8 years old, with intelligent eyes that had seen too much, and a strength in her small frame that spoke of a will that refused to be broken. She carried what appeared to be her younger brother, a skeletal child who might have been 5 or 6, though malnutrition made it impossible to tell. She walked directly up to the president, looked him in the eye, and asked the question that would change everything. "Are you just another spectator?" The words hit him like physical blows. In her voice he heard the accusation of every child he had failed to protect, every innocent he had unknowingly abandoned to this fate. He tried to speak, to explain, to defend himself, but no words came. The girl continued to stare at him, holding her brother closer to her chest. She said quietly, "We know who you are. We know about your palace, your meetings, your speeches about progress and prosperity. But what do any of those words mean if we remain buried alive?" The president felt tears streaming down his face. He reached out towards the children, but they began to fade, becoming translucent like smoke. "Find us," the girl whispered as she disappeared. "Find us before it's too late." He jolted awake with such violence that he knocked over his cold key, the porcelain cup shattering against the marble floor. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. For several minutes he sat frozen in his chair, the dream so vivid that he could still smell the fetid air of the underground prison. Slowly, shakily, he rose and walked to the mirror mounted on the wall between 2 windows. The face that looked back at him was that of a stranger, pale, drawn, eyes wide open with a mixture of horror and shame. This was the face of a man who had just discovered that his comfortable ignorance had been built on the suffering of children. "If this was truly a vision," he whispered to his reflection, "then I must act before it becomes prophecy." He walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of his study, a relic from his days as a young officer in the military. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was the uniform he had worn during his first deployment. Simple, utilitarian, bearing none of the ornate decorations of his current presidential regalia. As he lifted the uniform, memories flooded back, nights spent in trenches with common soldiers, sharing meals and fears and hopes for their country's future. When had he lost that connection to the people he served? When had the palace walls become barriers instead of bridges? "Tomorrow," he said to the empty room, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I will see my country through the eyes of those who have no voice. I will find those children, and I will not rest until they are free." The clock struck 1 in the morning as President Ibrahim Traore made the decision that would define the rest of his presidency, and perhaps the rest of his life. Dawn was still 3 hours away when President Traore made his way through the palace's secret passages to a room that officially didn't exist. The hidden chamber, accessible only through a bookshelf that swung open when a specific sequence of volumes was pulled, had been constructed during the colonial period as a safe room for French administrators. Now it served as a meeting place for conversations that could never appear in official records. The room was Spartanly furnished: a round table, 6 chairs, a secure communications system, and walls lined with soundproofing material. Maps of Barkina Faso covered every available surface, marked with notations in different colored inks, representing various security concerns, economic zones, and political considerations. Yaqub Sangare was already waiting, his weathered face grave with concern. At 52, he had served as the president's most trusted advisor for over a decade, but their relationship went back much further. They had been soldiers together, had shared foxholes and near-death experiences during the regional conflicts of their youth. If anyone could be trusted with what the president was about to propose, it was Yaqub. "Sir," Yaqub said, rising from his chair as the president entered. His eyes immediately noticed the civilian clothes, old jeans, a faded work shirt, boots that had seen better days. "What is this about?" The president gestured for him to sit, then spent the next 20 minutes recounting every detail of his dream. He described the underground mine, the children's faces, the girl's piercing question, and the overwhelming sense of shame that had awakened him. As he spoke, he watched Yaqub's expression shift from confusion to concern to something approaching awe. "You believe this was more than a dream," Yaqub said when the president finished. "It wasn't a question. I've been having similar nightmares for weeks, always children, always suffering, always asking why I do nothing. But this one was different. This one showed me specific places, specific faces. I think my subconscious has been trying to tell me something my conscious mind refused to acknowledge." Yaqub leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. As former special forces, he had learned to trust intuition as much as intelligence. "There have been rumors," he said slowly, "reports from regional commanders about unusual activity in remote mining areas, but nothing concrete enough to justify investigation. Because we weren't looking hard enough," the president said, "because it was easier to accept sanitized reports than to dig deeper into uncomfortable truths. If you're serious about this mission, and I can see that you are, we'll need to plan it carefully. No presidential security detail, no official vehicles, no communications with the palace. You'll be completely on your own." The president nodded. "That's exactly what I want. The moment this becomes an official presidential inspection, everyone involved will either disappear or put on a show for my benefit. I need to see the truth, unfiltered and unvarnished." Over the next 2 hours, they planned what amounted to a covert intelligence operation. Yaqub would arrange for a nondescript vehicle with rural license plates and fake registration papers. The president would need a completely convincing disguise, not just different clothes, but a different identity that would hold up under scrutiny. "We'll tell the security staff that you're taking a private retreat at the presidential lodge in Benfora," Yaqub suggested. "I'll arrange for communications blackouts that make it appear you're simply choosing to be incommunico for a few days." "And if something goes wrong? If I'm discovered or injured?" Yaqub's expression hardened. "Then I personally will burn down whatever place has harmed you and deal with the political consequences afterward." The president smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "You haven't changed since we were sergeants together." "Neither have you, sir. That's why this plan might actually work." They spent another hour going over details, emergency extraction procedures, coded communication methods, and contingency plans for various scenarios. By the time they finished, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the room's single small window. "There's one more thing," the president said as they prepared to leave. "If what I suspect is true, if there really are children being exploited in illegal mining operations, this won't end with a simple rescue mission. This will require a complete overhaul of how we monitor and regulate our extractive industries." "Revolutionary changes require revolutionary methods," Yaqub replied. "Perhaps it's time our government remembered what revolution actually means." The president spent the rest of the morning in normal presidential activities: meetings with ministers, phone calls with international partners, review of policy documents. But his mind was elsewhere, already walking through those tunnels of his dream, already feeling the weight of children's eyes upon him. That afternoon, he called his chief of staff into his private office. "Minister Bakary," he said, his tone carefully casual, "I've decided to take a few days at the lodge in Banfora, some quiet time to reflect and recharge." Bakary nodded approvingly. "An excellent idea, sir. You've been working too hard lately. Shall I arrange the security detail?" "Actually, I'd prefer to go alone this time. Just me and a driver. Sometimes a president needs to remember what solitude feels like." If Bakary found this request unusual, he didn't show it. "Of course, sir. I'll clear your schedule and make the arrangements." That evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traore stood once again at his study window. But this time, instead of seeing distant lights and wondering about the lives behind them, he was preparing to walk among those lives, to see his country through eyes unclouded by the comfortable distance of power. In 12 hours, he would cease to be the president of Barkina Faso and become something he hadn't been in years, a man searching for truth regardless of the cost. The transformation began at 4 in the morning in a safe house on the outskirts of Ouagadougou that Yacoub had secured without leaving any paper trail. The building, a modest concrete structure that had once housed a failed electronics repair shop, now served as the staging ground for an operation that could either redeem a presidency or destroy it. President Traore stared at his reflection in a cracked mirror as Yacoub worked with theatrical makeup and prosthetics acquired from a sympathetic theater director who asked no questions. Gray was added to his hair and beard, wrinkles deepened around his eyes, and his posture was altered with padding that made him appear both older and more stooped. "The key," Yacoub explained as he worked, "is not just to look different, but to think differently. You can't move like a president who's pretending to be poor. You have to move like a man who has always been poor." The clothes completed the transformation. Pants that had been carefully frayed and stained, a shirt with patches and holes that told stories of hard labor, boots that were worn but functional. A small bag contained everything he would need: basic toiletries, a few carefully aged documents establishing his identity as Mamadou Kone, a widowed miner from a village near the Ghanaian border. "Your backstory," Yacoub said, handing him a folder. "Study it. You've been mining for 30 years, lost your wife to malaria 2 years ago, have no children of your own. You're looking for work because the small mine where you worked was shut down by government regulations." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The vehicle was perfect for their purposes. A 15-year-old Toyota pickup truck, its paint faded by sun and dust, its bed scarred by years of hauling equipment and supplies. The registration papers identified it as belonging to a transport cooperative in Kédougou, and the license plates were authentically dirty and dented. As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, leaving the capital behind, the president felt himself shedding layers of his official identity. The weight of responsibility that had pressed on his shoulders for years began to shift, transforming from the burden of governing 8 million people to the simpler but more immediate challenge of understanding the life of one man seeking work. The countryside passed by in the gray light of early morning. Small villages where people were already beginning their daily routines. Fields where farmers prepared for another day of coaxing life from reluctant soil. Roadside markets where vendors arranged their modest displays of vegetables and crafts. "This is your country too," Yacoub observed, noting how intently the president watched the passing scenes. "But when was the last time you saw it without a motorcade and security perimeter?" The president couldn't remember. They drove for 3 days, following a circuitous route that took them through regions the president knew only from economic reports and administrative summaries. They slept in cheap roadside accommodations where the sheets were rough and the walls thin enough to hear neighboring conversations about crop failures, sick children, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. On the second night, in a cramped room above a trucker's cafe. The president lay awake listening to a family in the next room arguing about whether to send their 12-year-old son to work in the goldfields near Dori. The mother wept as she spoke about having no other choice to pay for their younger daughter's medical treatment. "It's only temporary," the father said, his voice hollow with self-justification, "just until we can get back on our feet." The president pressed his ear to the thin wall, straining to hear every word of a conversation that was being repeated in thousands of homes across his country every night. The academic discussions about child labor he had attended in air-conditioned conference rooms suddenly seemed obscenely abstract. On the third day, they reached their destination, a remote area near the border with Ghana, where illegal mining operations had been rumored for years but never conclusively documented. The landscape was scarred by both legal and illegal excavations, the earth torn open in a desperate search for the gold that could lift families out of poverty or condemn children to lives of exploitation. Yaqub stopped the truck near a cluster of makeshift buildings that served as a workers' camp for one of the larger operations. Men in dust-covered clothes sat in whatever shade they could find, sharing meals and gossip. Children played in the dirt between the buildings, their games innocent despite the harsh environment surrounding them. "This is where we part ways," Yaqub said, his voice heavy with concern. "Are you certain about this?" The president looked at the camp, then at his own reflection in the truck's side mirror. The man looking back at him was indeed Mamadou Kone, a weathered miner seeking work. But behind the disguise, Ibrahim Traore carried the weight of presidential responsibility and the memory of a dream that had shown him horrors he could no longer ignore. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. He shouldered his small bag, shook Yaqub's hand, and walked toward the camp. With each step, he left more of his presidential identity behind, becoming just another desperate man seeking whatever work he could find in the gold fields of Barkina Faso. The sun was beginning to set, painting the scarred landscape in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in this desolate region, children were working in conditions that no civilized society should tolerate. He was going to find them, and when he did, he would ensure that their suffering was not in vain. Behind him, Yaqub watched until the president disappeared among the camp buildings, then drove away into the gathering darkness, carrying with him the knowledge that the next time he saw his friend and leader, both of their lives would be fundamentally changed. The camp foreman, a stocky man named Ouedraogo, whose gold teeth gleamed when he smiled, looked at Mamadou Kone up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had hired desperate men for dangerous work his entire career. "You're old," he observed bluntly. "Mining is young man's work." "I'm strong," the president replied in the regional dialect he had learned as a child but rarely used in his presidential duties. "I've been digging gold since before most of these young men were born." Ouedraogo spat into the dust and shrugged. "We'll see. There's work in the deep shafts if you're not afraid of small spaces and bad air. 50 francs a day, plus meals. Take it or walk back to wherever you came from." 50 francs. Less than the cost of the morning coffee served to the president every day in his palace study. But for Mamadou Kone, it represented survival. "I'll take it." The foreman pointed to a group of ramshackle buildings on the far side of the camp. "Sleeping quarters are over there. Work starts at dawn. Don't cause trouble, don't ask questions, and maybe you'll last longer than the last old fool we hired." The president's quarters consisted of a wooden bunk in a room he shared with 7 other men, their ages ranging from teenagers to weathered miners in their 60s. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. His bunkmate, a thin man named Issouf, who appeared to be in his 40s but moved like someone much older, helped him claim a space for his few belongings. "First time in the deep shafts?" Yusuf asked quietly. "First time at this camp," the president replied carefully. "Good. Then you don't know enough to be scared yet." Yusuf's laugh was bitter. "The deep shafts are where they send the expendable ones, old men like us, troublemakers, anyone they don't mind losing if the tunnels collapse." That night, as the president lay on his narrow bunk, listening to the sound of men coughing and muttering in their sleep, he reflected on how completely his perspective had shifted in just a few hours. Yesterday, he had been concerned with abstract policy decisions and diplomatic protocols. Tonight, he was calculating how many days of 50 francs wages it would take to buy a decent meal. Dawn came too early, announced by a supervisor banging on the door and shouting for everyone to get up. The president joined the shuffle of men heading to a communal area where a breakfast of thin porridge and weak tea was served from large metal pots. The food was barely adequate, but the men ate with the focused intensity of people who never knew when their next meal might come. After breakfast, the president followed a group of workers to the entrance of what the locals called the Deep Hole, a shaft that descended nearly 50 meters into the earth, supported by a framework of rotting timbers and rusted metal supports that looked like they hadn't been inspected in years. The descent was terrifying. Workers climbed down using a series of rickety ladders, their only light coming from battery-powered headlamps that cast dancing shadows on the rough-cut walls. The air grew thicker and more oppressive with each meter of descent, carrying the smell of moist earth, powder fumes, and stagnant water. Of stagnant water, human waste, and something else, something that made the president's stomach clench with apprehension. At the bottom of the shaft, the truth was waiting for him. The main tunnel branched into a network of smaller passages, some so narrow that workers had to crawl on their hands and knees to navigate them. And in the smallest, most dangerous passages, the ones where cave-ins were most likely and escape would be impossible, children were working. The president's breath caught in his throat as he saw them, boys and girls who couldn't be older than 10 or 12, their small bodies perfectly suited to spaces where adults couldn't fit. They worked with primitive tools, scraping at veins of gold-bearing ore with their fingernails when proper equipment wasn't available. The conditions were exactly as he had seen in his dream, but reality was somehow worse than his sleeping mind had conjured. The children's skin was gray with dust and malnutrition. Their clothes were rags that provided neither warmth nor modesty. Their eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of spirits that had been broken and hopes that had been abandoned. A supervisor noticed the president staring and shoved him roughly toward a section of tunnel where adult workers were loading ore into buckets. "You're not here to sightsee, old man. Get to work or get out." The president began filling buckets with chunks of ore, but his mind was focused on memorizing every detail of what he was witnessing. The number of children, their apparent ages, the conditions of their work, the attitude of the supervisors who treated them as expendable equipment rather than human beings. During a brief rest period, one of the children, a girl who couldn't be older than 8, approached him. Her resemblance to the girl in his dream was so striking that for a moment he wondered if he was still asleep. "Grandfather," she whispered, using the respectful term children employed for elderly men. "Do you have any water?" The president looked around carefully, then pulled a small bottle from his bag and handed it to her. She drank greedily, then passed it to a younger boy who appeared to be her brother. "What are your names?" the president asked quietly. "I am Mariam. This is my brother Amadou. We've been here for 3 months. Where are your parents?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. "They sold us to pay for medicine for our baby sister." The men said we would work for 1 year and then go home, but they keep saying we haven't worked enough yet." The president felt something break inside his chest. This child, this brave, intelligent little girl had been sold into slavery by parents desperate enough to sacrifice 2 children in hopes of saving a third. "Mariam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "can you show me where you and the other children sleep?" She nodded and led him through a maze of tunnels to a section that had clearly been carved out specifically to house the child workers. The dormitory was a cave barely large enough for 20 children to lie down, with no sanitation facilities and only a single bucket of water that was changed weekly. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sweet, sick odor of infection and untreated injuries. Some children lay motionless, either sleeping or unconscious. Others sat in small groups, sharing scraps of food or trying to tend to each other's wounds. "How many of you are there?" the president asked quietly. 43, Mariam replied without hesitation. "We count every night to make sure nobody disappears." 43 children, 43 lives that had been stolen, bodies that were being used up, futures that were being destroyed for the sake of gold that would eventually adorn the necks and fingers of people who would never know the cost of their jewelry. That night, as the president lay in his bunk pretending to sleep, he composed a mental list of everything he had witnessed. But more importantly, he began formulating a plan, not just for rescuing these particular children, but for ensuring that no other children would ever face the same fate. The dream that had started this journey had shown him the question, "Are you just another spectator?" Now, surrounded by the sounds of exhausted miners and the distant echoes of children's voices from the depths below, he had his answer. No, he was not a spectator. He was a president who had finally learned what it meant to serve his people. The president's 4th day in the mine brought revelations that made his earlier discoveries seem almost benign by comparison. As Mamadou Kone, he had earned enough trust from his fellow workers to be included in conversations that would never have taken place in the presence of anyone connected to authority. During the midday rest period, while sharing a meager meal of millet porridge and dried fish, he listened to Issouf explain the true scope of the operation they were part of. "This isn't just one mine," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure the supervisors weren't within earshot. "There are dozens of them, scattered across 3 provinces, all connected, all feeding into the same network." "What kind of network?" the president asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Human trafficking," another worker named Kofi replied bluntly. "The gold is just a side business. The real money comes from selling people, children mostly, but sometimes adults who ask too many questions or cause too much trouble." The president's blood turned to ice. Selling them to whom? Plantations in Ivory Coast, fishing boats in Ghana, domestic work in wealthy households across West Africa. Sometimes they disappear entirely, probably shipped to North Africa or Europe. Kofi's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "The mine owners have agreements with transporters who move the children around like merchandise." "But surely someone in the government knows about this," the president said carefully. "Surely there are inspections, regulations." The workers exchanged looks that mixed amusement with disgust. "You really are new to this business," Issouf said. "The government gets its cut, just like everyone else. Why do you think these operations can function so openly? Half the officials in the capital have investments in these mines." The president's hands clenched involuntarily. The system of corruption and exploitation was far more extensive than he had imagined. This wasn't just a case of regulatory failure. This was institutional complicity at the highest levels. That afternoon, while working in a section of tunnel that brought him close to the children's area, he overheard a conversation between two supervisors that confirmed his worst fears. The shipment from Niger arrives tomorrow night, 25 new ones, ages 6 to 14. The buyers from Abidjan will be here Thursday to pick up the older group. What about the sick ones? Dispose of them. We can't have diseased merchandise affecting the value of the healthy ones. Dispose of them. The casual way the man discussed murdering children made the president's vision blur with rage. Only years of military training and political discipline prevented him from abandoning his cover and attacking the supervisors with his bare hands. Instead, he forced himself to memorize every word, every detail. This information would be crucial when he finally took action. That evening, after the day shift ended and most of the adult workers had returned to their quarters, the president volunteered for night security duty, a role that involved walking the perimeter of the camp and checking on the equipment. It was a job nobody else wanted because it paid only a few extra francs and required staying awake all night. But it gave him the freedom to move around the camp and observe activities that were normally hidden from the day workers. What he discovered was a logistical operation of stunning efficiency and breathtaking cruelty. The mine wasn't just a place where children were exploited, it was a hub in a sophisticated network that moved human beings like commodities across international borders. He watched as a convoy of trucks arrived under cover of darkness, their cargo areas filled with children who appeared to be from different ethnic groups and regions. Some looked like they might be from Chad or Niger. Others could have been from Mali or Ghana. All were terrified, malnourished, and clearly unfamiliar with their surroundings. The children were processed with the mechanical efficiency of a factory operation, documented, categorized by age and physical condition, and assigned to different sections of the camp based on their intended use. The youngest and smallest were sent to the narrowest mining tunnels. Older, stronger children were designated for heavy labor. Those who appeared sick or injured were separated into a group that, based on the supervisor's earlier conversation, would not be leaving the camp alive. The president watched from the shadows as families were separated, siblings torn apart, and children who had probably been sold by desperate parents were introduced to the reality of their new lives. The sounds of crying and pleading were quickly silenced by threats and violence. By dawn, the new arrivals had been absorbed into the camp's population, just another batch of raw material to be consumed by the machinery of exploitation. As the president returned to his quarters, his mind was working frantically to process everything he had witnessed. This wasn't just about the children in this particular mine. This was about an entire industry built on human trafficking, with roots that extended throughout West Africa and beyond. The scale of the problem was overwhelming, but it also clarified what needed to be done. This couldn't be addressed with a simple rescue operation or a few policy changes. This required a coordinated assault on the entire network, involving multiple countries and international law enforcement agencies. But first, he had to document everything he had seen and find a way to communicate with Yaqub without compromising his cover or endangering the children he had come to save. That morning, as he joined the other workers for their meager breakfast, he noticed that Mariam and her brother were not among the children. When he asked another child about them, the response made his blood run cold. "They were selected for transport," the child whispered. "They left with the truck convoy last night." The president closed his eyes and fought against the wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. 2 children he had come to care about, 2 innocent lives he had hoped to save, had been swept away by the very network he was trying to understand. But their fate also crystallized his resolve. Whatever it took, However long it required, he would destroy this system and ensure that no other children would suffer as Maryam and Amadou were suffering. The dream that had brought him here had asked him if he was just a spectator. Now, having witnessed the full scope of the evil he was confronting, he knew that he had moved far beyond spectating. He was now a combatant in a war for the souls of his nation's children, and he intended to win. The fifth day brought news that accelerated the president's timeline beyond all his careful planning. During the morning shift change, he overheard Obadrogo, the camp foreman, talking to someone on a satellite phone about government inspection threats and the need to clean house within the next 48 hours. The implications were terrifying. Someone, possibly his own security services, had detected unusual activity in the region and was preparing to investigate. The traffickers' response would be to eliminate evidence, which meant that dozens of children were about to be murdered to protect the network. The president realized that his careful observation phase was over. He had to act immediately, even if it meant exposing himself before he was fully prepared. That afternoon, while working in the deeper tunnels, he managed to speak privately with several of the older children who seemed to have maintained some leadership among their group. What he learned confirmed that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "They're separating us into different groups," a 12-year-old boy named Sekou explained. "The strong ones are being prepared for transport tonight. The sick ones—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. "What about the youngest ones?" the president asked. "They're in the deepest tunnels now. The supervisors say they're going to seal those sections permanently." Sekou's voice was steady, but his eyes showed the fear of a child who understood that he was discussing mass murder. The president felt time compressing around him. He had perhaps 12 hours before the systematic elimination of witnesses began, and he was 50 kilometers from the nearest government forces, with no way to communicate with Yaqub or coordinate a rescue operation. Unless he revealed his identity and took direct action. That evening, as the night shift prepared to begin work, the president made his decision. He approached the three oldest and most trusted children, Sekou, a 14-year-old girl named Fatima, and a 13-year-old boy named Ibrahim, who had been designated as a group leader by the supervisors. "Listen to me very carefully," he whispered, drawing them into a shadowed corner of the tunnel. "My name is not Mamadou Kone. I am President Ibrahim Traore of Barkina Faso, and I am here to save you." The children stared at him in stunned silence. Fatima was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. "You're lying. Why would the president be here?" "Because I had a dream," he replied simply. "A dream that showed me children suffering in places like this, and I realized that I had failed you all by not knowing, not seeing, not acting." He pulled out a small device he had kept hidden since his arrival, a presidential emergency beacon that would alert his security services to his exact location. "I'm going to activate this signal. Within 2 hours, this place will be surrounded by government forces, but we need to keep all of you alive until they arrive. Can you help me organize the others?" Sekou stepped forward, his young face showing a maturity born of unimaginable hardship. "If you really are the president, prove it. Tell us something only he would know." The president thought quickly, and then recited the opening lines of the national anthem in the original Moor language, followed by specific details about recent government programs that had been announced on national radio. The children's expressions gradually shifted from skepticism to amazement to hope. "What do you need us to do?" Ibrahim asked. "Gather everyone in the main chamber, quietly, without alerting the guards. Tell them that rescue is coming, but they must remain calm and stay together. And most importantly, identify which children are in the sealed tunnels so we can reach them first. As the children dispersed to carry out his instructions, the president activated his emergency beacon and then began moving through the mine with a purpose that had nothing to do with gold extraction and everything to do with human salvation. The transformation was remarkable. Word spread among the child workers with the speed of wildfire, but instead of chaos, there was organization. The older children took charge of the younger ones. Injuries were tended to with whatever materials could be found, and a defensive perimeter was established around the main chamber. When the guards finally noticed the unusual activity and came to investigate, they found themselves facing not cowering victims, but a group of children who had suddenly remembered that they were human beings deserving of dignity and protection. "What's happening here?" Ouedraogo demanded, pushing his way into the chamber with 3 armed supervisors behind him. The president stepped forward, shedding the last vestiges of his Mamadou Kone disguise. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What is happening is that you are about to be arrested for crimes against humanity," he said calmly. "I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Barkina Faso, and you have exactly 90 minutes before this facility is surrounded by government forces." Ouedraogo's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally terror, as he realized that the old miner he had dismissed as expendable was actually the most powerful man in the country. "You're lying," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" The president pulled out his presidential identification, then activated a secondary device that immediately connected him to the National Security Command Center in Ouagadougou. "This is President Traore," he said into the device, his voice carrying clearly in the underground chamber. "I am at coordinates 12.3 degrees north, 1.4 degrees west. Approximately 50 kilometers northeast of Ouagadougou in an illegal mining operation. I am requesting immediate military intervention for a hostage rescue operation involving an estimated 60 children. Authorization code Alpha 774. The response was immediate and professional. "Copy, Mr. President. We have your location locked. Multiple units are en route. ETA 90 minutes. Are you in immediate danger?" "Negative for now, but the situation could deteriorate quickly. Be advised that this is part of an international trafficking network and there may be attempts to eliminate evidence. Highest priority is preservation of life." He closed the connection and looked at Ouedraogo, whose face had now gone completely pale. "As I said, 90 minutes. I suggest you use that time to gather your staff and prepare to surrender peacefully. Any harm that comes to these children between now and then will be considered a personal attack on me, with all the consequences that implies." The next hour passed in tense standoff. The supervisors huddled together, clearly debating whether to fight, flee, or surrender. Some of the adult workers who had been unaware of the trafficking operation looked on in shock as the full scope of what they had been unknowingly supporting became clear. The children, meanwhile, stayed close to the president, their fear beginning to give way to something they hadn't felt in months: hope. The first sounds of the approaching rescue operation came exactly 87 minutes after the president's call. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the pre-dawn air, followed by the rumble of heavy vehicles approaching along the access roads. The president had spent those 90 minutes doing something no government official had ever done for these children: listening to their stories. Each account was a chronicle of betrayal, desperation, and survival that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Aisha, barely 7 years old, had been sold by an uncle after her parents died in a car accident. She had been in the mines for 8 months and had almost forgotten what sunlight looked like. Musa, a 10-year-old from a village near the Mali border, had been kidnapped while walking to school and transported across 3 countries before ending up in this hole in the ground. Salamata, at 13, the oldest girl in the group, had been promised work as a house servant in Ouagadougou, but had instead been brought here and forced to work in conditions that would have killed many adults. Each story reinforced the president's growing understanding that this wasn't just a crime against these particular children, it was a symptom of systemic failures that went to the heart of West African society. The sound of boots on metal and voices calling out tactical positions signaled that the rescue force had reached the mine entrance. The president moved to the tunnel opening and called out in a voice that echoed through the underground chambers. "This is President Traore. I am approximately 50 meters below ground, with 63 child hostages and 4 adult suspects. The area is secure, but I need medical teams and child welfare specialists immediately." The response came from Colonel Dramani, the commander of his presidential guard. "Mr. President, we are sending teams down immediately. Are you injured?" "Negative, but the children require urgent medical attention, and we need to process them carefully. This is a trauma situation, not just a rescue operation." Over the next 2 hours, the underground prison was transformed into a scene of organized salvation. Military medics descended into the tunnels to provide immediate care for the most seriously injured children. Social workers and child psychologists, hastily summoned from Ouagadougou, began the delicate process of assessing the children's conditions and preparing them for integration back into society. The president insisted on personally accompanying each child as they were brought to the surface, many of them seeing natural sunlight for the first time in months. The sight of these small figures blinking in the dawn light, with their faces a mixture of wonder and fear, was one that would define the rest of his presidency. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Fatima, the 14-year-old who had first challenged his identity, approached him as the last of the children were being loaded into medical transport vehicles. "Mr. President," she said formally, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, "thank you for not being just another spectator." The echo of his dream came rushing back. The same words, spoken by a different girl in circumstances that now seemed prophetic rather than merely nightmarish. "Thank you," he replied quietly, "for teaching me what it really means to be a president." The arrests of Ouedraogo and his supervisors were merely the beginning. Under interrogation and faced with evidence that their operation had been thoroughly documented, they quickly provided information about the broader network of trafficking operations throughout the region. Within 72 hours, coordinated raids across 3 countries had shut down 17 illegal mining operations and liberated over 400 children. International arrest warrants were issued for dozens of trafficking coordinators, and several high-ranking officials in multiple governments found themselves under investigation for corruption and complicity.
But for President Traore, the most important moment came 3 days later, when he stood before the assembled children in a hastily established rehabilitation center in Ouagadougou. They sat in neat rows, clean clothes replacing their mining rags, medical attention healing their physical wounds, but their eyes still carrying the wariness of those who had learned not to trust adult promises. "I made each of you a promise," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I promised that you would be free, Today, I want to make you a new promise. You will never be forgotten. You will never be abandoned. And what happened to you will never happen to another child in this country as long as I have the power to prevent it. One small hand rose from the audience. Aisha, the 7-year-old whose uncle had sold her. "Mr. President," she asked, in the clear voice of a child who had learned to speak up or perish, "what happens to us now?" He realized the most important question he had ever been asked as leader. "Now," he said, "you become the reason this country changes. You become the evidence that every child matters, that every life has value, that a nation is only as strong as its commitment to protecting its most vulnerable citizens." He paused, looking at each young face, seeing in them not just victims, but the future of Burkina Faso itself. "And now, you help me figure out how to make sure this never happens again." The revelation that the president of Burkina Faso had personally infiltrated an illegal mining operation to rescue trafficked children sent shockwaves through the international community and forced a complete reevaluation of West Africa's approach to child labor and human trafficking. Within days of the rescue, President Traoré found himself at the center of a media storm that reached far beyond his country's borders. International news crews descended on Ouagadougou, and his phone rang constantly with calls from world leaders, human rights organizations, and international development agencies. But the most significant conversations were happening not in conference rooms or television studios, but in the quiet spaces where he met with the rescued children and began to understand the full scope of the changes that would be necessary to prevent future tragedies. Dr. Aminata Sow, a child psychologist who had been hastily recruited from Dakar to lead the rehabilitation program, briefed him on the children's conditions during a meeting in his office that had been cleared of all other appointments. "Mr. President," she said, consulting a thick folder of case files, "what these children have experienced goes beyond physical exploitation. They have been systematically dehumanized, taught to see themselves as commodities rather than individuals with rights and futures." She opened the folder and showed him photographs that documented the children's physical conditions upon rescue: malnutrition, infected wounds, signs of physical abuse, and the hollow expressions of young people who had learned not to hope. The physical healing will take months. The psychological healing will take years. And the social reintegration, that will require changes to the entire structure of how we think about children's rights in this region. The president studied the photographs, each one a silent accusation against a system that had allowed such conditions to exist. "What do you recommend?" "First, we need to understand that these children can't simply be returned to the conditions that made them vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. Many of them were sold by family members who were themselves desperate. Others were orphaned or abandoned and had no social safety net." She pulled out a map of West Africa marked with pins in different colors. "Second, we need to recognize that this is a regional problem that requires regional solutions. The trafficking networks cross multiple borders, and children are moved between countries as easily as other commodities." The president stood and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where some of the rescued children were playing under the supervision of social workers. Their laughter, tentative but genuine, provided the soundtrack to the most important policy discussion of his presidency. What would it take, he asked, to create a system where no child in West Africa could be sold into slavery? Dr. So was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the magnitude of what he was asking. It would require fundamental changes to economic structures, social services, law enforcement, and international cooperation. It would mean challenging interests that are very powerful and very wealthy. In other words, the president said, it would require the kind of comprehensive reform that most politicians avoid because it's too difficult and too expensive. Exactly. The president turned back to the window, watching as Aisha helped a younger child navigate the playground equipment. The little girl who had been sold by her uncle was now taking responsibility for protecting others, a lesson in leadership that shamed most of the adults in his government. Dr. So, I want you to design a program that doesn't just rehabilitate these children, but transform them into advocates for change. I want them to become the living evidence of why these reforms are necessary. Over the following weeks, the president embarked on what his staff privately called the Children's Crusade, a comprehensive campaign to restructure Burkina Faso's approach to child welfare and protection. The first step was legislative. The passage of the Children's Protection Act, which established the harshest penalties in Africa for child trafficking, created specialized courts for prosecuting crimes against children, and mandated that any business or organization found to be using child labor would forfeit all assets to a children's welfare fund. The second step was institutional. The creation of the National Children's Protection Agency, with field offices in every province and the authority to investigate any report of child exploitation without prior approval from local officials. The third step was economic. The establishment of family support programs that would provide emergency assistance to families facing the kind of desperation that led to children being sold or abandoned. But the most radical step was educational. The integration of the rescued children themselves into the process of reform. 6 months after the rescue, President Traoré stood before an assembly unlike any that had ever convened in Burkina Faso's history. The National Assembly Hall, usually reserved for lawmakers and dignitaries, was filled with children aged 7 to 17, some rescued from the mining operations, others who had survived different forms of exploitation, and still others who were simply representatives of their communities. This was the first session of what the president had decided to call the Children's Parliament, an advisory body that would have a formal role in developing and reviewing policies affecting young people throughout the country. The idea had emerged from his conversations with the rescued children, who had repeatedly demonstrated insights into the causes and solutions to child exploitation that surpassed those of most adult experts. If these children could survive the horrors they had experienced and still maintain the capacity for hope and change, he reasoned that they deserved a voice in shaping the society that had both failed and ultimately saved them. Fatima, now 15, and having shown remarkable leadership during the rehabilitation process, had been elected by her peers to serve as the first speaker of the Children's Parliament. She stood at the podium that had hosted presidents and prime ministers, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the
Mr. President, she began, her voice steady and clear. We thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak for those who have no voice. But we want you to know that we are not here just to ask for help. We are here to offer our help in making sure that what happened to us never happens to any other child. She gestured to the other children seated around her. We know things that adults don't know. We know how traffickers choose their victims. We know which children are most at risk. We know what kinds of promises sound believable to desperate families. And we know what kind of support would have prevented us from being vulnerable in the first place. The president listened as, one by one, the children presented their recommendations. Their proposals were specific, practical, and informed by lived experience that no academic study could replicate. Musa, the boy who had been kidnapped on his way to school, spoke about the need for safe transportation programs for children in rural areas. Salamata, who had been deceived by false promises of domestic work, outlined an early warning system for identifying fraudulent employment schemes. Aisha, despite her young age, had developed a comprehensive plan for supporting families in crisis before they reached the point of selling their children. Each presentation was more sophisticated than many policy papers the president had reviewed from his adult advisors. More importantly, each one was grounded in an understanding of vulnerability and resilience that could only come from having lived through the darkest experiences and emerged with hope intact. When the session concluded, the president addressed the children directly. Today, you have taught me something that no university course or policy seminar could teach. You have shown me that the people who have experienced injustice are often the best qualified to design justice. You have proven that survivors are not just victims to be pitied, but experts to be consulted. He paused, looking around the room at faces that still bore the physical and emotional scars of their ordeals, but also radiated a determination that he found both humbling and inspiring. I hereby commit that no major policy affecting children in Burkina Faso will be developed without input from this Parliament. Your voices will be heard not as charity, but as necessity. Your experiences will guide our decisions not because we feel sorry for you, but because you have earned the right to shape the future you will inherit. The applause that followed was unlike any the president had ever heard in that hall. It was not the polite, measured response of political protocol, but the enthusiastic celebration of young people who had suddenly realized that their opinions mattered to the adults who controlled their world. But the most powerful moment came when Aisha approached the podium for the final presentation of the day. At barely 8 years old, she was the youngest member of the parliament, but her presence commanded attention. "Mr. President," she said, her voice small, amplified by the microphone system, "you asked me once what happens to us now. I think I know the answer." She looked around the room, making eye contact with her fellow parliament members, then turned back to face the president. "What happens to us now is that we become the adults who make sure no child ever has to ask that question again. What happens to us now is that we become the proof that even the worst things can't destroy hope. What happens to us now is that we show the world that children are not just the future, we are the present, and we have something important to say." As the session concluded and the children filed out of the assembly hall, chattering excitedly about their first experience as official advisors to their government. The president remained at his seat, overwhelmed by the transformation he was witnessing. These children had been rescued from the depths of exploitation and despair, but in the process they had also rescued him from the comfortable ignorance that had allowed such conditions to exist. They had forced him to confront the gap between the country he thought he was governing and the country that actually existed. More importantly, they had shown him a path forward that was based not on traditional political calculations, but on the revolutionary idea that those who had suffered most from systemic failures were exactly the people who should design systemic solutions. The Children's Parliament would meet monthly, providing ongoing input on everything from education policy to economic development programs. But its real significance was symbolic. It represented a fundamental shift in how power and expertise were understood in Burkina Faso. Children were no longer just subjects to be protected, they were citizens to be consulted. And for the first time since taking office, President Ibrahim Traore felt that he was truly serving all of his people. The success of the Children's Parliament and the broader reforms in Burkina Faso quickly attracted international attention, but not all of it was positive. Other West African leaders, many of whom presided over countries with similar exploitation problems, viewed President Traore's initiatives with suspicion and concern. The first major test came at a regional summit in Abidjan, where the president found himself defending his approach against colleagues who saw his reforms as implicit criticism of their own governance. "Ibrahim," said President Kanate of Ivory Coast during a private dinner among the heads of state, "your theatrical rescue operation has created unrealistic expectations throughout the region. Children in my country are now demanding the same rights and protections your rescued children received. It's causing significant social disruption." "Good," he replied simply. "If children demanding basic human rights causes social disruption, then perhaps our societies need to be disrupted." The conversation that followed was tense, with several leaders expressing concerns that Burkina Faso's new approach to child welfare was destabilizing traditional social structures and economic arrangements throughout West Africa. President Ouattara of Mali was particularly blunt. "You've opened a door that can't be closed. These children's rights initiatives are spreading across borders faster than we can control them. My own ministers are now demanding budget allocations for programs we never needed before." "Programs you never thought you needed," the president corrected. "The children who would benefit from those programs have been suffering in silence for years. Just because we didn't hear their voices doesn't mean they weren't crying out." The tension in the room was palpable, but President Traore had not come to this summit to seek approval from his colleagues. He had come to challenge them to confront the same uncomfortable truths he had been forced to face. He stood and addressed the assembled leaders directly. "Gentlemen, 6 months ago, I thought I was governing a stable, developing country with manageable social problems. Then I discovered that children in my own territory were being sold into slavery while I sat in my palace reviewing economic statistics that meant nothing." He pulled out his phone and displayed a photograph of the children in the underground mine, their faces hollow with desperation and malnutrition. "This is what stability looks like when you're not paying attention. This is what economic development means when it's built on the exploitation of the most vulnerable. This is what governance becomes when leaders stop seeing the governed as human beings." The room was silent. Several leaders avoided making eye contact, but President Traore continued. "You can criticize my methods. You can question my policies, but you cannot deny that there are children in each of your countries who are suffering right now while we sit in this comfortable room debating whether protecting them is politically convenient." He sat back down and waited for the responses he knew would come. President Diallo of Guinea was the first to speak. "Even if we accept your premise, Ibrahim, the economic costs of the reforms you're proposing would be staggering. Where do you expect us to find the resources for universal child protection services?" "The same place we found resources for presidential palaces, military equipment, and international travel," the president replied. "It's a matter of priorities, not capabilities." The summit continued for 3 more days, with increasingly heated debates about children's rights, economic development models, and the role of government in protecting vulnerable populations. By the end, it was clear that President Traore's approach had divided the regional leadership into 2 camps: those who saw child protection as a luxury they couldn't afford, and those who were beginning to recognize it as a necessity they couldn't ignore. But the real victory came not from convincing his fellow presidents, but from the attention the summit generated among civil society organizations, international development agencies, and, most importantly, children's rights advocates throughout Africa. Within weeks of the summit, similar children's parliaments were being established in Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. International funding organizations began requiring child protection impact assessments for all development projects in West Africa. And, most significantly, a network of child advocates began forming across the region, with the rescued children from Burkina Faso serving as trainers and mentors for young people in other countries who were organizing to demand their rights. The movement that had begun with a president's nightmare had evolved into a continental awakening to the reality of child exploitation and the possibility of child empowerment. 18 months after the mine rescue, President Ibrahim Traore found himself in an unexpected position, addressing the United Nations General Assembly not as a regional leader seeking international assistance, but as the architect of what child welfare experts were calling the Burkina Faso model of child protection and empowerment. The speech he delivered that day would be remembered as one of the most powerful addresses in UN history, not because of its rhetoric, but because of the truth it told about the gap between international declarations on children's rights and the daily reality of millions of young people around the world. "Excellencies," he began, looking out at an assembly hall filled with the world's most powerful leaders. 2 years ago, I believed that governing meant managing statistics, balancing budgets, and maintaining diplomatic relationships. I measured my success by GDP growth, international investment, and favorable media coverage." He paused, allowing the familiar comfort of those metrics to settle in the minds of his audience before disrupting it completely. "Then I had a dream. A nightmare, actually. A vision of children buried alive in the pursuit of gold, their small hands bleeding as they scratched at the earth to make wealthy people wealthier. I dismissed it as stress, as the product of too many late nights reviewing policy documents." The assembly hall, usually buzzing with the quiet conversations of delegates who had heard thousands of similar speeches, was completely silent. But the dream returned night after night, until I realized it wasn't a dream at all. It was my conscience trying to break through the comfortable barrier of willful ignorance that separated me from the children I had sworn to protect. He described his journey to the mines, his days working alongside enslaved children, and the rescue operation that had saved not just 63 young lives, but had awakened an entire nation to the reality of exploitation that thrived in the shadows of apparent progress. The children I found in those mines taught me something that no political science course, no diplomatic briefing, no economic analysis had ever conveyed. That a nation's true strength is not measured by its gold reserves or its international relationships, but how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. Then he did something unprecedented in the history of UN General Assembly addresses. He invited the children themselves to speak. Fatima, now 16, and having emerged as an internationally recognized advocate for children's rights, approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had learned that her voice mattered. "Excellencies," she said, her words carrying the weight of lived experience that no adult speechwriter could replicate. "We are here to ask for your pity. We are here to demand your action." She was joined by Musa, Salamata, and Aisha, each now trained in public speaking and policy analysis, each carrying the credibility that comes only from having survived the systems they were critiquing. Together, they presented a comprehensive analysis of child exploitation patterns throughout Africa, detailed recommendations for international cooperation on trafficking prevention, and a proposed framework for including children's voices in all policy decisions that affected their lives. The presentation was more sophisticated and better researched than most policy papers produced by international development organizations. More importantly, it was delivered with the moral authority of young people who had experienced the consequences of adult failures and had chosen to transform their suffering into advocacy for others. When they finished, the assembly hall erupted in applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. But the real impact was measured not in the immediate response, but in the commitments that followed. Within 6 months, the UN had established a Children's Advisory Council with formal input into all programs affecting young people. The International Criminal Court announced a specialized unit for prosecuting crimes against children. And most significantly, the African Union adopted the Ouagadougou Protocol on Child Protection, which required all member states to establish children's parliaments and include young people's perspectives in governance. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was the emergence of what media outlets began calling the Barkina generation. Young people throughout Africa and beyond who had been inspired by the example of children who had transformed their victimization into leadership. 5 years after the dream that changed everything, President Ibrahim Traore stood once again at the window of his study in the presidential palace. But the view had changed dramatically. Where once he had seen distant lights and wondered about the lives behind them, he now saw the illuminated buildings of the Ouagadougou Children's Center, a complex that included the original rehabilitation facility and International Training Center for Child Protection Professionals and the headquarters of the Children's Parliament that had become a model for similar institutions in 37 countries. The transformation of Burkina Faso had been profound, but not without challenges. The comprehensive reforms had required massive investments in social services, education, and law enforcement. Some economic sectors had struggled to adapt to strict child labor prohibitions. International mining companies had initially threatened to withdraw from the country rather than comply with the new protection standards. But the result had validated every difficult decision. Child trafficking cases had dropped by 94%. School enrollment rates had reached levels previously thought impossible. Most remarkably, Burkina Faso had become a destination for families fleeing exploitation in other countries, rather than a source of trafficked children. The economic benefits had been equally impressive. International investors, initially wary of the social reforms, had discovered that a country serious about protecting its children was also serious about rule of law, transparency, and long-term stability. Development aid had poured in from organizations that recognized Burkina Faso as a model for sustainable social change. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the faces of children who had learned to expect protection rather than exploitation, education rather than labor, hope rather than despair. As the president watched from his window, he could see Aisha, now 13 and serving as the youngest ever deputy speaker of the Children's Parliament, leading a group of international visitors through the center courtyard. The little girl who had once been sold by her uncle was now training adults from around the world in child protection methodologies. Fatima, at 21, had become the first graduate of the center to earn admission to university, where she was studying international law with the intention of establishing a career in children's rights advocacy. Musa had returned to his home village as a community organizer, working to establish local child protection networks. Salamata had become a counselor, specializing in helping newly rescued children navigate the trauma recovery process. Each of them had chosen to transform their experiences of exploitation into expertise in protection. Each had decided that their suffering would have meaning only if it prevented others from enduring similar fates. The president's reflection was interrupted by a knock on his study door. Yaqub entered, now serving as director of the National Children's Protection Agency, carrying a folder that had become familiar over the years. "The monthly report, sir," he said, setting the folder on the president's desk. "I think you'll find this one particularly encouraging." The president opened the folder to find statistics that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. 0 reported cases of child trafficking in the past 3 months, a 98% primary school completion rate, and documented evidence that Burkina Faso's child protection networks had helped rescue over 800 children in neighboring countries. But the most significant item in the report was a letter from the United Nations Secretary General formally inviting President Traoré to serve as the first Director General of a new UN agency for children's rights and protection. "They want you to take the Burkina Faso model global," Yaqub observed. The president considered the offer. It would mean leaving the presidency, giving up the direct governance role that had allowed him to implement such comprehensive reforms. But it would also mean the opportunity to influence child protection policies in every country in the world. "What do you think that children would advise?" he asked. Yaqub smiled. "I think they'd tell you to follow the example they've set, transform your experience into expertise, and use that expertise to protect others." The president nodded, his decision made. "Schedule a session with the Children's Parliament for next week. If I'm going to make this choice, I want their input first." As Yaqub left to make the arrangements, the president returned to his window. The lights of the Children's Center seemed brighter tonight, illuminating not just the courtyard below, but the path forward for a movement that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined when a dream first woke him from comfortable ignorance. The question that had haunted that dream, "Are you just another spectator?" had been answered not just with words, but with action that had transformed lives, changed policies, and inspired a generation of young advocates around the world. He was no longer a spectator to suffering. He had become an architect of hope. And tomorrow he would begin building that hope on a global scale. 10 years after the dream that changed everything, the Ouagadougou Children's Center hosted its first international conference on child-led governance. Delegates from 89 countries gathered to share experiences, develop best practices, and plan the next phase of what had become known as the Children's Rights Revolution. The conference was unique in the history of international diplomacy. For every adult delegate, there was a child counterpart with equal voice and voting rights. Policy sessions were co-chaired by experienced administrators and young advocates. Research presentations were delivered by both academic experts and survivor experts who had lived through the systems being analyzed. The opening ceremony was addressed not by heads of state or international officials, but by members of the original Children's Parliament of Barkina Faso, now young adults who had spent a decade proving that those who had experienced injustice were uniquely qualified to design justice. Aisha, at 18, had become the first person to serve as both a child parliamentarian and an adult policy advisor, bridging the gap between youth advocacy and governmental implementation. Her opening address captured the essence of what had been accomplished and what remained to be done. 10 years ago, she said, looking out at an audience that included former presidents, current prime ministers, and children from every continent, we were invisible. Our suffering was hidden in places where powerful people never looked. Our voices were silenced by those who preferred not to hear uncomfortable truths. She paused, allowing the weight of that history to settle in the minds of everyone present. Today, we are not just visible, we are essential. No major policy affecting children in over 40 countries is developed without input from young people themselves. No international development program is funded without demonstrating meaningful child participation. No government can claim to serve its people while ignoring the voices of its youngest citizens. The applause that followed came not just from the children in the audience, but from the adults who had learned to recognize expertise wherever it resided, regardless of age. But the most powerful moment of the conference came during the closing ceremony when a video message was played from President Ibrahim Traore, now serving his second term as UN Director General for Children's Rights and Protection. He appeared on screen sitting not in an ornate office, but in a simple classroom surrounded by children from a refugee camp in Jordan, where he had been working to establish new protection protocols. "My friends," he said, addressing the conference participants directly. 10 years ago, I asked myself a question that changed my life. What does it mean to truly serve the people? Today, I can answer that question with certainty. He gestured to the children around him, their faces representing dozens of nationalities and backgrounds, but sharing the same expression of hope that had become familiar to anyone working in child protection. To serve means to see. To serve means to listen. To serve means to act, even when action is uncomfortable, expensive, or politically inconvenient. But most importantly, to serve means to recognize that those who need protection most are often those best qualified to design that protection. The camera panned across the faces of children who were clearly hanging on his every word, then returned to focus on the former president whose dream had started a global movement. The dream that brought me to those underground mines was a nightmare of children suffering in darkness. Today, because of the courage and wisdom of those children themselves, that nightmare has become a dream fulfilled, a world where every child's voice matters. Every child's welfare is protected, and every child's potential is recognized as humanity's most precious resource. As the video ended, the conference delegates, both adult and child, rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 15 minutes. But more importantly, they returned to their home countries carrying concrete plans, proven methodologies, and the unwavering conviction that protecting children was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for building just and sustainable societies. 20 years after a president's dream first revealed the hidden suffering of enslaved children, the world had fundamentally changed its approach to child welfare and protection. What had begun as one man's personal awakening had evolved into a global transformation of how societies understood their responsibilities to their youngest members. The statistics were remarkable. Child trafficking had decreased by 78% globally. School enrollment rates had reached historic highs in every region, and over 100 countries had established formal mechanisms for including children's voices in governance. But beyond the numbers lay a more profound shift in consciousness. Children were no longer seen merely as future citizens to be protected, but as current citizens with valuable perspectives to contribute. Their experiences of vulnerability had been recognized as expertise in resilience. Their capacity for hope in the face of despair had been acknowledged as a form of leadership that adults desperately needed to learn. The Barkina Faso model had been adapted to different cultural contexts and political systems around the world, but its core principle remained constant. Those who had experienced injustice were uniquely qualified to design justice. In refugee camps, former child soldiers had become peace negotiators. In urban slums, survivors of child labor had become labor rights advocates. In rural communities, children who had been denied education had become the architects of inclusive school systems. Each success story traced its origins back to a simple but revolutionary idea: that wisdom could emerge from suffering, that leadership could develop from survival, and that the most marginalized voices often carried the most essential truths. Dr. Aminata Sow, now director of the International Institute for Child-Led Development, published her landmark study, From Victims to Visionaries: 20 Years of Child-Led Social Change, on the anniversary of the first mine rescue. Her research documented not just the policy changes and institutional reforms that had emerged from the children's rights movement, but the psychological and social factors that had enabled traumatized children to become effective advocates for systemic change. The children rescued from those mines in Burkina Faso possessed something that most adults had lost. They had experienced the worst that human systems could inflict, but they had not lost their capacity to imagine something better. They had seen evil up close, but they had not become cynical about the possibility of good. Her study became required reading in schools of public policy, social work, and international development around the world, cementing the intellectual foundation for child-centered approaches to governance and social change. But perhaps the most powerful testament to the transformation came from an unexpected source: a letter written by Ouedraogo, the former mine foreman who had enslaved the children, from his prison cell where he was serving a life sentence for crimes against humanity. The letter, addressed to President Traoré and published with his permission in international media, provided a unique perspective on the changes that had occurred. It read, "Mr. President, I write this not seeking forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but to bear witness to something I could not understand when I was committing my crimes against those children. I saw them as things to be used, bodies to be exploited, problems to be managed. I never saw them as human beings with thoughts, feelings, dreams, and wisdom. I treated them as commodities because that is how the entire system taught me to see them. But you did something that no one had ever done before. You saw them as teachers. You recognized that they had something to offer, not just something to be saved from. You understood that their experience of our cruelty had given them unique insight into how to prevent that cruelty from being inflicted on others. I have spent 15 years in this prison watching news reports about the children I tortured becoming leaders, advocates, and experts. I have seen Aisha testifying before international tribunals, Fatima designing refugee protection protocols, Musa training police officers in child-sensitive investigation methods. These children, whom I tried to destroy, have become more powerful than I ever was. But their power comes not from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the determination to prevent it. I am writing this letter because I want the world to know. Those children did not just survive what we did to them. They transformed it into something that will protect millions of other children from experiencing what they experienced. That is a kind of victory that someone like me could never understand, but which everyone like you should recognize and celebrate. The letter was read aloud at memorial services held around the world on the 20th anniversary of the mine rescue, serving as a reminder that the children's movement had succeeded not through revenge or retribution, but through the much more difficult path of transforming suffering into service. On a quiet evening in Ouagadougou, as the sun set over a city that had been transformed by 2 decades of child-centered governance, an elderly man sat in the courtyard of the Children's Center reading stories to a group of young visitors from around the world. Ibrahim Tarore, now in his 70s and serving as Chancellor Emeritus of the Global University for Child Rights, had maintained this tradition for years. Every week, he would spend an evening with children, sharing stories about courage, hope, and the power of dreams to change reality. Tonight's audience included refugee children from Syria, former street children from Brazil, young climate activists from Bangladesh, and local children from Ouagadougou, whose parents brought them to learn about their city's history. "Tell us the story about the dream," requested a 10-year-old girl from Somalia, whose family had fled conflict and found sanctuary in one of the world's first child-designed refugee centers. The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with the same light that had guided him through the underground mines so many years before. "Once upon a time," he began, using the traditional opening that children recognized in every language, "there was a man who thought he was very important because he lived in a big palace and made decisions that affected millions of people. But he had forgotten the most important thing about being a leader. He had stopped listening to the people he was supposed to serve. He was so comfortable in his palace that he couldn't hear the cries of children who were suffering just a few miles away. Then one night, he had a dream." As he told the story, the children listened with the rapt attention that only young people recognize when they recognize themselves in a narrative. They had all experienced forms of suffering, displacement, or marginalization, but they had all also experienced the transformative power of adults who learned to see them not just as problems to be solved, but as partners in solving problems. When he finished the story, a boy from Bangladesh raised his hand. "Mr. Tarore, do you think the dream is finished now? Have all the children been saved?" The old man was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without destroying hope. "The dream is not finished," he said finally. "It continues every time a child finds the courage to speak truth to power. It continues every time an adult learns to listen to voices they had ignored. It continues every time someone chooses to see suffering and act to end it, rather than looking away because action is difficult. He gestured to the children around him, their faces representing the beautiful diversity of humanity, united by shared experiences of resilience and hope. "You are the dream continuing," he told them. "Each of you carries within yourself the power to transform suffering into service, survival into leadership, dreams into reality." The question is not whether the dream is finished. The question is, what will you dream next, and how will you make those dreams come true? As the evening ended, and the children dispersed to their various accommodations, some in loving families, others in carefully designed care facilities, all in environments that prioritized their safety, education, and empowerment, the old man remained in the courtyard. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had been shining 20 years ago when he first heard a child's voice asking if he was just another spectator. Those stars had witnessed the transformation of that question into a movement that had changed the world. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges. Children in new places would need protection. Adults in positions of power would need to be awakened to their responsibilities. Systems designed to exploit the vulnerable would need to be dismantled and replaced with structures that empowered the marginalized. But tonight, in this courtyard where the sound of children's laughter had replaced the echoes of their suffering, Ibrahim Traore allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The dream that had awakened him from comfortable ignorance had become a reality that continued to awaken others. The children were safe. The children were heard. The children were leading. The dream continued. This expanded story, while fictional in its specific details, draws inspiration from real struggles against child labor, human trafficking, and systematic exploitation that continue to affect millions of children worldwide. The transformation depicted here represents not just one leader's journey from ignorance to action, but humanity's ongoing obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. The Barkina Faso model described in this narrative reflects actual innovations in child protection and participation that have emerged from various countries and organizations around the world. The concept of children's parliaments, survivor-led advocacy, and trauma-informed governance are all based on real approaches that have proven effective in different contexts. Most importantly, this story serves as a testament to the remarkable resilience, wisdom, and leadership capacity of young people who have survived the worst that adult systems can inflict. Their voices, experiences, and insights represent one of humanity's most underutilized resources for creating just and sustainable societies. The dream that began this story, a leader's awakening to hidden suffering, reflects the kind of moral awakening that is possible for any individual, organization, or society willing to look beyond comfortable assumptions and confront uncomfortable truths. The question posed by the child in that original dream, "Are you just another spectator?" remains relevant for every reader. Will you observe injustice from a distance, or will you act to transform it? The children in this story chose transformation over resignation, service over self-pity, and hope over despair. Their example suggests that such choices remain available to all of us, regardless of our circumstances or the magnitude of the challenges we face. Their dream continues. The question is, how will you help make it reality?